In this lecture, we will cover the facets of declarative knowledge as well as schema theory. Let's take a look at the contents of long-term memory. I list three here. The first is declarative knowledge, the focus of this lecture. Declarative knowledge is knowing that, such as specific facts, generalities, and personal preference. Second is procedural knowledge, which is knowing how. This is knowledge in action. And finally, conditional knowledge, knowing when and why. This is knowing how to apply what we know at the appropriate time. In this lecture, we will focus on the first of these contents, which is declarative knowledge. There are two forms of declarative knowledge. The first is episodic memory. This is memory for a specific event we experience. It's tied to a specific time and place, and elaborated and organized episodic memories are remembered better. You might have an episodic memory for a wedding or a funeral or a time in college or a childhood memory. These are all episodic memories. A specific type of episodic memory is known as flashbulb memory. Basically, a flashbulb memory is a very emotionally significant event. And the example that's used a lot is September 11th and the event that took place in New York. A lot of people remember exactly what they wore, who they were with, what they're doing, what clothes they were wearing. And this is an example of flashbulb memory because it's an extremely vivid imagery memory for that event. And others include, here in Oklahoma, we had a tornado in 2013. There's many other examples. The second type of declarative knowledge is semantic memory. This is memory for meaning or general factual knowledge or information. An example is state capitals. For instance, what's the capital of Oklahoma? Well, that's Oklahoma City. Knowing that fact is an example of semantic memory, which is one of the forms of declarative knowledge. Now, importantly, you can remember factual information better if you have a pre-existing schema for it. But what is a schema? Well, let's talk about it on the next slide. So what exactly is a schema? Well, it's an organized framework of declarative knowledge. A schema represents our knowledge in a very predictable and readily accessible form, and it's used to interpret our experiences. Basically, a schema is a way that we can categorize incoming information, and we can group things together, pieces of chunks of information together. For instance, if you see somebody playing a sport, you can group what they're doing into your schema and figure out what their sport they're playing. Do they have bats and a ball and gloves? Well, all these individual items fit into my baseball schema. Now, individuals interpret information differently based on their different schemas. We all have different prior experiences, and therefore our schemas have developed differently. And so we bring in information, relate it to all the knowledge and schemas that we have, and try to fit into our existing knowledge. For instance, somebody from Australia might see a bat and a ball and a glove, and they might not think baseball. Rather, that fits their schema for cricket, which is a similar game to baseball. So let's do a little exercise with this idea of schema in mind. I want you to write down everything you know about restaurants, every detail. So pause the video, and when you're finished writing everything you know about restaurants, press play, and we'll match it to what I have and see if our schemas align. When I think of a restaurant, I think of appetizers, entrees, waiters, hostesses, dessert, a bill, maybe wine or soda, reservation, valet parking, tips. These are all details that come to my mind. And so each of these chunks of information are in my schema for a restaurant. However, somebody else might think of this schema. It's affordable, easy access, fries, soda, red and yellow. Maybe they're thinking of McDonald's or Burger King or Carlos Jr. A drive-through, kids meal, fast, ketchup, a line. Now, what's different here is that maybe before it was a sit-down restaurant, this is an example of a fast food restaurant. And this could be two individuals, very different details of what a restaurant is, showing that individuals can have very different schemas for the same concept. So let's look at the effects of schema. I'm going to read you this passage, and I want you to think about what's occurring here. Write down your answer if you can. If not, think it in your head. The procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange the items into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient, depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to the lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you are pretty well set. Follow the appropriate procedure for each group. It is important not to overdo things. That is, it is better to do too few things at once than too many. In the short run, this may not seem important, but complications can easily arise. If special materials are called for, they must be carefully measured and introduced gradually. A mistake here can be costly. After the procedure is completed, you arrange the items into different groups again. Then they can be put into their appropriate places. Eventually, they will be used once more, and the whole cycle will then have to be repeated. However, that is part of life. Now, I want you to think about what was occurring here. It's difficult, isn't it? Not having the schema placed in your mind, individuals will think of a lot of different answers for what they believe this passage to be. Let's try another one. Okay, so let's try passage 2. This time I'm going to give you a word to help you out right here. Clothes. Now I want you to try to think about what's going on here. The procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange the clothes into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you are pretty well set. Follow the appropriate procedure for each group. It is important not to overdo things. That it is better to do too few things at once than too many. In the short run, this may not seem important, but complications can easily arise. If special materials are called for, they must be carefully measured and introduced gradually. A mistake here can be costly. After the procedure is completed, you arrange the items into different groups again, then they can be put into the appropriate places. Eventually, they will be used once more, and the whole cycle will have to be repeated. However, that is part of life. Now, with this clue here, clothes, it was probably pretty easy to guess that this passage was about doing laundry. And so having that schema in your mind before you read a passage can really change how you interpret incoming information, which has, as you can imagine, or as you can put together, important implications for teaching. Let's try one more time. I want you to think about what's happening in this passage. Rocky slowly got up from the mat, planning his escape. He hesitated a moment and thought, things are not going well. What bothered him the most was being held, especially since the charge against him had been weak. He considered his present situation. The lock that held him was strong, but he thought he could break it. He knew, however, that his timing would have to be perfect. Rocky was aware that it was because of his early roughness that he had been penalized so severely, much too severely from his point of view. The situation was becoming frustrating. The pressure had been grinding on him for way too long. He was being ridden unmercifully. Rocky was getting angry now. He felt he was ready to make his move. He knew that his success or failure would depend on what he did in the next few seconds. So now, I'd like you to write down what you think was happening in this passage. Did you think of a wrestling match? A lot of people do. However, a lot of people also think of a prison escape. But there are many answers. Some people think it's a dog or a horse being caged or held up against its will. I've heard all types of answers. The point here is that based on your schema, you interpreted this passage differently. Now I want you to imagine a classroom full of 30 students and you're trying to teach them a concept. They all have different prior experiences and thus different schemas, and therefore they may all be interpreting your instruction differently. So how are schemata used? Well, they're used to construct meaning. We select a tentative schema and use the available information to confirm or disconfirm our choice. During recall, schemata are used to guide reconstruction of the information presented. When there are gaps in our memory representation, we use our schemata to help us fill them in, sometimes accurately and sometimes inaccurately. We often make memories to fit our schemata, whether they did originally or not exist. And then finally, existing schemata, which are inaccurate, can cause considerable confusion or interference. There are 3 types of schema-related learning. The first is accretion. This is adding to the general store of specific episodes without changing the schema. We use the schema to interpret our experience, but do not change the schema. For instance, I had coffee for breakfast. We're not changing our schema at all. We're just adding that in. The next type is tuning, refining an existing schema by adding to or restricting variables. For example, finding out that tennis balls come in different colors. This may be different, but you're not restructuring your entire schema. You're saying, okay, tennis balls, fuzzy with lines, yellow, bright green. They can also be purple, orange, whatever. Or, not all 4-legged animals are dogs. Sometimes kids believe this or have this misconception, and they just need to add to their existing schema, or they need to slightly refine their existing schema. And then finally, restructuring. This is creating a whole new schema or replacing a faulty one, often sometimes referred to as conceptual change. And here's an example. Restructuring the way you think about the shape of our planet. A lot of children believe that the planet is flat because it makes sense with experience. You can't stand on the bottom of something or else you'll fall off. So how can people stand on the bottom of Earth? Well, they developed this idea that it's flat. And so they, through a lot of effort, they can completely restructure that piece of knowledge, really collection of knowledge, into recognizing that the world is spherical. So what factors affect accretion and subsequent remembering? First is elaboration. The number of connections a proposition has with other schema and memory really impacts learning related to schemas. The greater the elaboration, the easier it is to retrieve or reconstruct because you have so many cues that can bring that information to the forethought. Another factor is organization. Systematic, predictable organization improves retrieval and reconstruction. We tend to impose organization when it is lacking, and organization provides direction for memory search. We can also use things like a graphic advanced organizer to help us organize our information. And it's almost a schema on paper, as you can see here. This is a schema for transportation and all the different things that are related to it. And this can help us organize and remember, recall, and reconstruct knowledge. Another method for helping us organize and recall information is a pictorial advanced organizer. And here's a good example of the seasons and what happens to foliage. And then finally, encoding specificity is a factor affecting accretion. What is stored is determined by what is perceived and how it is encoded, and what is stored determines what retrieval cues are effective in providing access to what is stored. The greater the initial elaboration, the better will be retrieval and reconstruction. And the implication is really help your students elaborate on content that they're learning in a meaningful way by relating it to prior knowledge and experience and helping students to make it personally relevant to their own lives. So what are the teaching implications from this lecture on declarative knowledge and schema? Well, there are two types of declarative knowledge, episodic and semantic, and these are learned differently, so it's important to know what type of knowledge you're teaching and to teach it in the most effective manner. Next, students have different schemas that impact learning differently. Again, imagine a classroom full of 30 students and they all have different experiences and prior knowledge, and they're all interpreting your instruction differently. So it's important to try to get students to learn things on their own and make it personally relevant to their own knowledge and experience. And finally, help students elaborate and organize knowledge. Again, relate it to prior knowledge and experience and organize it in some kind of useful, meaningful way, such as an advanced organizer or a concept map or whatever is effective for your students.